The Solar Tide. Prologue. The first wall. Its foundations had been laid 3,000 years ago, when the golden ages of Gunug were not quite so ephemeral and remote. When memories of a god-king possessed of the blood of Gazorgu, who had dwelt in the garden-girdled Temple of the Sun in Surgirkar, were still alive and well in the hearts of the Yug, the Lion Folk. When the magics of their priesthood had not yet waned, and the rivers of their fatherland fed fields so rich and golden that there were no pigments available to the painter's art which might properly render them in mural. When mud had been the substance of its brick, and the greatest of its foes would have been heavy Kandari cavalry, or wild Ida giants, or iron-clad Shaishan warriors bearing ladders or rams. Even then, in its youth, it had been an awesome sight, spanning all the eastern rim of the kingdom, the entire western bank of the old river Luma, which the upstart canine folk beyond the border call the Nekok. The wall had not been the eastern edge of Gunug in those days. The ancient domain of the people of the sun reached yet further south and east in those much-loved elder centuries, when the warmth of the dawn was greater, and the blood of their maker flowed with far more vigor in their veins. But it had been the greatest fortification, for the deep and broad waters of the Luma made military crossings treacherous even at the best of times. Its currents served as a 1,000-mile moat which dulled even the fiercest assaults from the opposing east bank. When the Sholoshaishans finally conquered Teotihuacan, and the last of the lion folk there were slain or driven west into the core of their homeland, it had been the first wall upon which the canine legions eventually crashed and halted. While on some occasions an invader, several times the legions of Sholoshaidi, and several others the ravening barbarian hordes of Ida or Kandari warbands, had breached the first wall and spilled into the fertile hinterland beyond, none had ever done so without horrible cost, and none, maimed as their armies were, ever managed to press through the fortress nation's many inner defenses and break open the holy city of Surgirkar after the first wall was raised against them. Time, though, had brought change to the first wall, even in a highly traditional and cautious culture like that of the Ug, and with good reason, for across the river Luma, in Sholoshaidi, vast foundries and siege works of the enemy had labored long years to create weapons which could crack open the first wall. For centuries, muzzle-loaded cannon had been their produce. As the past 5 decades had played out, the cannon of old had been replaced with newer, fiercer gunnery. Based on Lautani intelligence, the command and nobility of Gunug had believed they knew what to expect when the next war with the Sholoshaishans came, and the years of the new century had been spent tirelessly renovating and rebuilding perhaps the greatest bulwark on the face of Haraklan. Steel-ribbed concrete had replaced brick, and great artillery pieces, often forged overseas as ship's armament in the harbors of the Lautani de Umbrit, had been installed in the bunkers along the line. Many floors of firing avenues set into the wall had been equipped with machine gun emplacements to rake the dark waters of the Luma, and the angles and depressions of the structure as it wound along the bank allowed their firing lines to overlap in terrible kill zones, which would surely reap a mortal toll on prospective invaders. The bank itself had been dug mostly away, meaning the river's current lapped along the deep-set foundations of the sheer and unforgiving concrete, and no muddy beach remained at the roots of that 100-foot barrier for invaders to find purchase on. Behind, great earthworks concealed tunnels and bunkers and barracks which housed and fed whole divisions of Gunug's soldiery as garrison to surge forth like angered ants unseen and man the walls in the event of assault. Often dozens of feet of raw soil and stone rested atop 10 or 20-foot thick ceilings shored up with steel plating. The Kingdom of Gunug's martial stratagem had for 30 centuries been defense, and while a Sholoshaitan soul might contend the bulwark defending the imperial capital of Tepeclan stood firmer, there was, in truth, no way to compare the two in terms of sheer scale. Gunug's first wall was masterful, meticulous, monumental in its scope and ambition, a testament to millennia of war and paranoia and cruel experience. And it was but one of multiple, equally titanic lines of defense. But Sholoshaitan too had intelligence. The balloons, and later sputtering canvas-winged planes, of Sholoshaitan had often risked the sky above the border river to observe these constructions in earlier years. More crucially, the Lautani catfolk who were loyal to the Empire had become masters of subterfuge, sabotage, and espionage, and though the Ug had naturally done their best to keep the inner machinations of their prized fortification in shadow, nothing could stop details from being dragged forth for hostile eyes to see. And so Sholoshaitan too had planned and prepared with all the ferocious scale and divine fury bestowed to an empire which ruled most of the known world. The resources of half a dozen peoples and the provender of billions of souls were at the disposal of the enemy, and unfortunately for Gunug, the proud Sholoshaitans had just as much experience in breaking walls as the lion folk they sought to crush had in guarding them. It began just after dusk, on the night of the 5th of Metzli, as a cool spring mist rose from the Luma to trouble a windless night. The war had been on for a week by then, and yet no shells had fallen. But the Ug were not fools. Just as they had been mobilizing and shifting divisions to the frontier along the first wall, so too must Sholoshaitan have been mustering legions somewhere out in the borderland beyond sight. But the dry lands out past the eastern riverbank remained empty, and though signs of dust and disturbance along the rolling hills of the horizon were glimpsed now and then on clear nights, it was thought among the command on the wall that the Sholoshaitan advance which must come would produce a great deal of upheaval and warning as the soldiers were marshaled, that there would be ample sign before the great hammer blow fell, that no bombardment, however tenacious, could be maintained for long enough to so maim the first wall that its defenders would not be able to take to the battlements and fight when at last the assault came over the river. The fall of the first shells marked the beginning of the long agony which would dispel that optimistic notion. Lieutenant Durank woke to the rumble of thunder, the same noise he had fallen asleep to 4 hours earlier. But this thunder was stronger, more tangible than it had ever been before. Thunder was the only way he could interpret the noise, the cacophony, which rattled the bunks and tipped several of his men onto the cold stone of the hard floor. As the haze of nervous dream left him, and his consciousness rushed back in with all the hectic clarity of a threatened beast roused by a predator's howl, Durank thought first that it was an earthquake, that it couldn't possibly be the enemy's shells causing the commotion. Several of the tables, scattered with the bottles and refuse of the evening carousing which had become so common among the bored soldiers holed up in the bunkers of the first wall, had been wholly overturned, and the sharp shattered glass and clay of their burdens was strewn wild across the concrete. One of the heavy flickering overhead light fixtures had been shaken loose from the ceiling above, and had crashed down upon one of his machine gunners, Ganu, who was now rolling around on the floor clutching the bleeding gash it had left in his scalp. The rifleman Enoch had trodden in broken glass as he rose from sleep, and was now hopping and plucking chunks of it from his flesh as Corporal Arif tried to calm his underling down. The bunk holding Farouk and Gurdoz, Durank's 2 youngest, who had never seen action even in the Ida borderlands, had snapped or buckled in the chaos. Farouk had leapt from the top bed, and was now scrambling to pull Gordos out from beneath the two thin mattresses as the latter cursed and spat and yelled. Then young Hashun, a mortarman, was at his bedside, asking what was happening, stammering out a request for orders, his bag gripped nervously in his trembling hands, a sign the mortarman knew full well how bad things were, perhaps better than Durank. Earthquake, Durank thought again. It had to be. What else could so totally upend their resting place where it lay some 20 feet beneath the surface? But he had no time to give voice to this thought, or to issue a preemptive order to evacuate the bunker. The rumbling of the blast which had woken them, and, he would later figure, the many others playing out up and down the line, was followed by a second. Immediately afterward, a third, a fourth. More crashing, more struggling, more fallen lights and venting, more confusion. All this took 2 or 3 seconds, the blink of an eye to Durank, and in that third second the remaining lights in that catacomb of concrete and steel went out. "Out!" Durank shouted as he found his feet in the dark. "All who hear me, get out! Out!" He bumped hard into Hashun, but had the presence of mind to grab the younger man before he tumbled, and hold the mortarman upright. He groped beneath his cot and had his rifle in his right hand the next moment. Then, dragging Hashun with his left, he stumbled blind towards where he knew the exit to be, knocking his shins and unshod feet against cheap bed frames and table legs and struggling men as he went. All the while he called for his soldiers to follow him, to trace his voice, though he knew as he screamed himself hoarse that most would not hear him, so great was the thunder of the shelling. That was the first time he had associated that word with what was happening. Shelling. Surely such a thing was impossible, that shells, no matter how long they'd fallen, could do this sort of damage to the defenses backing the first wall. But the whistling descents and distant shouts down the corridors of the complex beyond the doorway he sought told him that must be what this was. For 3 nights and 3 days the dogmen had thrown their munitions at the Ugh line, and Durank, along with all those in the rear bunkhouses that fed to the front line of the first wall, had been bottled up in the innards of the fortress, confident in its perseverance, assured each and every hour that things were still well under control. When Durank had found sleep near midnight on the 4th night, he had been certain they must soon give up the hope of crippling the wall and launch a costly assault. Had the Sholoshaitians not ceased their firing in all the hours he'd slept? How many shells did they have to fling, and how come Gunug's own guns weren't silencing them? Were the folk of the sun so badly outranged? At last, gasping and swearing with a desperation which had nothing to do with physical exertion, Durank shouldered the harsh outline of the plain stone doorway. He flung Hashun through it one-handed, pressed out into the corridor after him, and then turned back in the blackness to shout for his men, to give them some trace of direction. Forms shoved or bumbled past him in the dark, some through the doorway and others passing him in the hall as they made for the exits, but he paid them no heed. He counted each which emerged from his bunkhouse. 1, then 2, then after an agonizing few seconds, 3. That made 5, including Durank and the mortarman. He called again. This was only 1/10 of his platoon. There were over 40 men left in there. Dust and hot air and shrieks flew up the hall behind Lieutenant Durank as some neighboring bunkhouse in the bunker complex was breached and scoured. He started coughing, the wretched dry heaves of one inhaling rubble and dust. His eyes burned. Though he could not see, Durank knew there was smoke and dust in the air, and he prayed there was no active fire somewhere off down the corridors. The vents and fans would all be off now, he knew. Any fire would be the death of them, Sholoshaitian assault or no. The rumbling of the explosions above ground never faltered, and as the cries of confusion or surprise or pain out in all that echoing blackness died down, Their rumbling became the dominant sound in his throbbing ears once more. Still he was screaming into the open doorway to his bunkhouse, and still no more men had passed him to escape it. But he was certain he could hear coughing and shuffling deep within. He had to go back. Durank turned to the place where Hashun rasped and trembled in the dark. Durank only then realized he was still gripping tight to the younger mortarman with one hand. He shifted the hand to Hashun's shoulder, gripping it firmly. "I'm going back in there to look for more," Durank shouted to him, summoning up all the firmness his rank and career could give him in so uncertain an hour, and praying to Gazorgu that some of it rubbed off on Hashun. "Go down the west hall for the far exits with the others. Don't—" But Lieutenant Durank was blown off his feet and into the opposing wall of the hall before he could finish his order. The wind was knocked from his burning lungs, and his rifle was knocked from his grip. Another man, perhaps Hashun, perhaps one of the others escaped from the bunkhouse, fell down on top of him as he lay in a heap upon the concrete floor, somehow tossed upward in the tumult. More hot air and choking smoke, and more clatter and clamor as rubble and refuse skittered down from rents in the unseen ceiling. Durank's fur was slick with 100 small cuts and gashes, his underclothes ragged, his mane tossed and torn, but he registered none of this. He was on his feet again, groping across to the doorway to his bunkhouse. He passed through, and for a moment Durank's spirit lifted. It had not been wholly breached. There might still be hope. But he fell upon a slope of rubble and rebar in the gloom a few feet in, and that hope was dashed. There was a rasping cough beneath his knees as he fell, a form half buried in the churned earth and metal. He called out as he felt a man's shoulders in the dust, and he knew even in the dark that the gasp which answered belonged to Corporal Arif. He bumbled around in the dark as Arif groaned, guessing the lesser officer was partially buried, and desperate to determine how deeply he'd been buried. A light seared Durank's eyes then as it flared into life behind him. The air was so choked with the swirling silt clouds of collapse, and his pupils were so shocked by the sudden onslaught of light that he had to blink stupidly for a time before he regained control of himself. "Just got it out and working, sir. Forgot I had it in my pack the moment everything went bad, mad as that sounds." The voice came from beside him in the murk of shattered concrete haze. It was Hashun, he knew. As Durank's eyes adjusted, he found himself knelt at the edge of a great rift of fallen dirt and steel and stone which had devoured their bunkhouse, just a few feet in from the hall door. A bloody and hacking Arif was beneath him, flat on his stomach against the cool ground and buried up to his chest. Durank began frantically to dig with his hands, gouging his palms on sharp edges and breaking his claws in the refuse, Hashun leaning over him to provide that weak but blessed glow from his shaky flashlight. Then Enoch and Farouk were kneeling beside him. They must have been two of the three who'd slipped past in the dark, Durank reasoned, and bloodying their own hands in the rubble. It took over 10 minutes to extricate Corporal Arif from the ruin of the bunkhouse, and every moment brought more thunder from above. More distant screams and thumping shell bursts and booted footfalls and rumbling collapses echoed clear even in their near-deafened ringing ears from far off in the complex. But all of them remained focused on their task, somehow too absorbed by the need at hand to worry about further collapses or escape in the moment. Arif himself had taken a bad gash to the forehead which had left him blinded by a thick paste of blood and concrete grit which caked his face, and it took some time for him to clear his ragged lungs enough to speak. He had taken a bad puncture in the stomach from a twisted piece of rebar. Something in the corporal's hip or upper leg was either broken or badly torn beneath the debris, and he could not stand, much less walk, on his own. "Hold him up, Enoch," Durank said, rising to his feet, and helping a shaken Arif up as he went. "Hashun, who else made it out? I felt a third come past in the dark before it all came down." "It's Ganu, sir," Hashun answered, throwing the beam of his light back into the dusty hall towards a silhouette hunched and leaning against the far wall. "He's hurt too." The glance told Durank as much. The slick damp on the younger Ug's matted mane glinted in the sickly yellow light. Perhaps Durank imagined it, but he thought even through all the far-flung clamor of the ongoing bombardment, he heard the drip of seeping blood striking the concrete at Ganu's bare feet. There was a shallow pool there, and it was growing. "Farouk, you're on Ganu," Durank said. His voice, he was happy to hear through the throb of his growing headache and the keening whine of his ringing ears, sounded far smoother than his racing thoughts. "Help him stay upright. We're going out into the halls. We have to find someone up the chain and find out what's to be done about this." "Gurdoz is still in there," Enoch said, breathless, but for far deeper reasons than the dig they'd just finished. "All of them are. Shouldn't we try to dig for them, sir?" There was a long stretch of something which couldn't rightly be called silence after that. Perhaps half a minute, far longer than was reasonable. Now and then one of them coughed, or sniffed at the damp air, or flinched at a particularly close drum of the enemy artillery's thunder. But none of it broke until Durank spoke aloud the conclusion they'd all come to during that tense span of not quite quiet. "It's been too long already, if they're in the thick of it. There might be pockets and survivors in them, but we have no equipment, and we don't have enough men. Command's surely still intact. We'll see what their plan is. We'll need teams if we're going to get back in there." Durank knew as well as any of the others that he'd almost certainly pronounced death sentences with those words. But there was no arguing them, and every Ug soldier huddled around the shadows of that doorway understood. "Hashun, give me your light, and get my rifle off the floor there," Durank ordered. "Everyone fall in behind me, Wounded in the middle and Hashun in the rear. Call out if I'm getting too far ahead." Durank was sure not to move too quickly. Enoch limped on his torn foot, and though he never complained beneath the weight of Arif, his lieutenant knew the gashed sole of his bare foot must be gnawing at him on such tattered ground. Ganu was near unresponsive at this point, whether due to blood loss or the concussive force of the blow he'd taken before the collapse, and Farouk was all but carrying the man, whispering prayers and assurances to the wounded which the others pretended not to overhear. None had boots, and the scuffle of their fleshy footfalls in the dust and grime of the gloomy hall seemed strange and out of place. Their line moved west, further from the front, towards the command and hospital bunkers at the rear of the complex. The next 5 bunkhouses they passed along the hall were collapsed as wholly as theirs had been, and the 6th was only partly caved in. A few dozen shaken stragglers remained in the hall here or there, but only a handful were aware enough to notice the light and answer Durank's call for them to fall in behind the group. The rest seemed too stunned to move just yet, and Durank left them be for the time being. Then, about halfway up the hall, as Durank began to lead the growing column through one of the sharp-angled bends in the corridor meant to deny invaders a clear avenue of fire all the way down the line should the inner forts ever be breached, he found their way blocked. The corridor on the other end of that bend was wholly collapsed, as the bunkhouses had been. 2 riflemen, neither past their 20th year by the looks of them, were pressed up against the wall of rubble, absently palming and rolling chunks of it, as if it might all dissolve away if only they plucked free the right piece of shattered concrete. "When did this hall go down?" One of the 2 men looked back to Durank as he spoke, but the other did not. He stared a long while before he answered, his dust-reddened eyes straining against the light. Durank put the beam towards the floor to spare the man's shocked pupils. Hashun's cheap little blessed flashlight was still, so far as they'd seen, the only light which had been spared burial in the complex. "About a few minutes ago?" The rifleman's voice was shaky, uncertain. "All right," Durank said, nodding, trying his very best to look undisturbed. "Any runners come through with commands before it came down?" I don't know," the rifleman answered. "Lieutenant Urzun was leading us up the way to get orders. See if they'd need us up front, or if they still wanted us to hang back as ordered. See what the situation was up top. But he and the others were all up ahead when it all came down on us." "Urzun," Durank said. "You were in bunkhouse 16 then. We just saw your place back up the way. Not nearly as torn up as ours. How many made it out?" "I don't know," the rifleman said again. "Maybe 40, 50? Durank nodded. "And you're it now, you two?" "Yes, sir." "Well, you come with me," Durank told them, taking both by the shoulders and guiding them back into the midst of his column. "We're going to get out of here." They did as ordered. Durank took point once again, and on the way back, he picked up all the stragglers who hadn't fallen in with him on the way up the hall. At the entrance to bunkhouse 16, he had all his unhurt boys toss the unscathed parts of the room for packs and rifles. By the time they marched on eastward for the front of the complex, almost everyone had a rifle, and there had been 4 more flashlights added to the column. Though almost none were wearing proper uniforms or boots, they didn't trouble with that. Time seemed too pressed for already maimed and shaken men to be clomping around trying to find boots that fit. Troublesome as it was, their main priority now was to escape the tomb which was fast closing in around them, and if possible, get to the front of the first wall. "Shaishans will be coming soon, don't you think? Now that they've broke the wall." The voice echoed up to Durank's ears from somewhere in the line behind him as they marched past the entrance of bunkhouse 10, where all his men lay buried. He didn't know who the question had been aimed at, but still he answered. "They'll come," Durank said. "They can't shell forever. But don't say they've broken the first wall. They've just damaged part of it. We aren't gone just yet." This seemed to shore up the courage of the ragtag group, something more felt than seen in all that swirling haze of tossed dust. But that renewed courage was tested when, around the door of bunkhouse 7, they met another wall of debris which barred their path. The forward walk to the wall complex was, so far as they could tell from this side, buried. "Back to the bunkhouse 9 door," Durank called down the line. "There's an exit to the top there. We can't go up while the bombardment is on, but waiting in the stairwell will be a safer bet than the halls." And so they went. The stairwell itself was behind a thick steel door, and the bar upon it took 2 men to slide out of place. It swung open, and the pale light of a coming dawn spilled into the hall, the first sunlight any of them had seen since the bombardment began. None of the bunkhouses from 8 upward in Hall 90 had been rotated onto the emplacements of the first wall proper since the Sholo-Shaishan bombardment began. Their turns hadn't come, and so this hint of smoke-eaten sun was all the taste of Gazorgu's warmth they'd had in the better part of a week. There were nearly 50 of them now, Durank the sole surviving lieutenant among them. They closed the door behind them and sat down in the bottom of the stairwell, tight together and looking as if they'd just rucked a full day's march. The stairway was sharp, more an emergency exit than a proper access point, and its concrete overhang seemed untroubled by the shells as yet. The angle of the stairway was such that they couldn't see the exit up above them, and no shell could fall directly in atop them. Still, they kept low at Durank's urging. "I'm going up to get a glimpse of the wall," Durank told Hashan, pulling the mortarman aside. "If I don't come back down, you're in charge. Arif is too out of sorts to command. Get the men to some other officer if possible after the shells stop, and if you can't find command, then get them to what's left of the wall to fight off whatever Sholo-Shaishan offensive follows." Hashun nodded. "I will, sir." Durank clapped him on the shoulder. It felt awkward, but the mortarman smiled as he went back to his seat among the others, and Durank was glad he had done it. The truth was, no Ida skirmish on the northern borderland had ever scared him so badly as all this. It was one thing to fight, and quite another thing to be fought at, as it were, to be shelled and shot by men he couldn't so much as smell, let alone see. And yet, shaken as he himself was, the fact he had so many eyes on him kept him sane and outwardly collected. He'd performed well, thank Gazorgu, so far as could be expected under such circumstances. He climbed the steps and came to the mouth of the stairwell, sidling out from beneath the protecting lip of the concrete overhang, expecting to take just a moment's stolen glance and then dive back into relative safety as the storm of steel tossed up by shellfire continued playing out all about him. But what he saw east of their position was so terrible that he would remain crouched there on the topmost steps for nearly 2 minutes, before Hashun came up to drag him back down out of danger. Hashun too would see it, however briefly, and to the young mortarman's credit, he would say nothing of it to the others during the long days of bombardment. But both Durank and Hashun knew, and with knowing, hope seemed vain to muster. Churned soil and charred stumps had replaced the open, grassy dryland of the surrounding country. Out east, where the rise of earth atop the stout bunkers of the impenetrable first wall overlooking the river Loma should be, was a great miles-long depression in the landscape, as if a team of motivated excavators and engineers had been at work for months, undoing all the years of work Gunug's folk had wrought there. Hither and thither along that depression jutted up battered concrete teeth, the bunkers and firing lines of the wall, most of which were broken and silent, unlit by the muzzle flashes of returned artillery fire in the gray of the dull dawn. For as far as Durank could see, north or south, the damage was equally total. The first wall had been broken, and the unseen Sholoshaishan artillerymen beyond the river who had broken it were not even done hurling shells.